Using my bandsaw, I resawed some wood, both maple and walnut, down to strips of about 1/8 of an inch thick. I did several strips of each type of wood, and then I laid them all out and added glue. I made sure to spread the glue around and get as much coverage as possible between the two pieces of wood because I'm going to cut the pieces for the game out of these strips. I glued up one pair of boards and then added a strip of tape. And this is really just to keep some separation in between the different sets of boards. In case there's any glue leakage, they won't all get glued together. Once I had all these pieces done, I used clamps to make one big stack of them so they would all get clamped at the same time. I cut a piece of plywood down to 12 inches square, then I lowered the blade and moved the fence over. So when I ran the board over the blade, it just cut the blade's width off the outside edge. I ran it through 4 times, spinning it 90 degrees each time. I followed the same procedure, just moving the fence over, making all the cuts, moving the fence over, making all the cuts, and eventually I cut the center lines. I made 2 cuts for this with 1 turn in between. I ended up with a nice even grid. To frame this out, I cut several 1-inch strips of the same material. On the first piece, I cut the miters a little bit long and then went back and trimmed them until they were a perfect fit. Once I had one that fit perfectly on the side, I used it as a reference point to cut the other 3 exactly the same. This helps them to all fit really snugly around the outside of the board and always match up in the corners. I set up some clamps and glued up all the side pieces. It's really important that you add glue not only to the sides that are touching the game board, but also to the corners so that all the joints are nice and strong. After I let these set up for a while, I took it all out of the clamps and then I needed to fill the gaps in the game board itself. And to do that, I used some 2-part epoxy. After it was fully mixed, I started to pour it into the grid that I had cut. The idea here was that it would become an inlay, and I didn't really want it to cover the entire top, but as I started to fill in these gaps, it was getting everywhere. I decided to go ahead and try to get everything filled, and I would come back and sand down the top later. In fact, I had to do some more epoxy because I didn't mix up enough the first time. With this second batch, I was just trying to fill it in so that all of the inlay was level with the top surface. Turns out I had excess. I went ahead and let it dry, and then after it was dried, I sanded it down. But I quickly realized that if I sanded too much, I would sand through the top veneer of the plywood, and I didn't want that. I decided to go ahead and cover the whole thing with epoxy to have a solid surface, but before I did that, I needed to have a lip around it so the epoxy wouldn't run off the edge. To do that, I cut down some more strips of the walnut that I used earlier and got out my box joint jig. Most times when you use one of these, you have to do quite a few tests to make sure that everything fits correctly. I'm not going to show you any of that, but eventually I ended up with a really nice fit. With one corner working, I set it in place and then marked the ends of the pieces so I knew exactly how long they needed to be and still have enough length for the fingers. Once you get a jig like this set up, it's really quick to cut the rest of the pieces, and as long as you don't adjust anything, you can use it for the same settings next time. All of these pieces were a little bit wide, so I just had to trim off one edge to make sure that everything was even with the width of the fingers. After that, I did a test fit just to make sure that everything was right before I started gluing anything up. I wanted the grid here to actually sit below the top edge of the wood just a little bit, so I put some spacers underneath it when I put it upside down. I added glue to all the fingers and then started wrapping it around the game board, and then I realized that I hadn't put any glue in between the board and the frame itself. Luckily, it all stayed in place while I added some glue to the outside of the plywood and then set it all together before clamping it up. Once it was partially clamped, I flipped it over so that I could make sure that the spacers were giving me an even spacing on all 4 sides of the game board. I used my CNC to cut out the 64 circle game pieces, but if you don't have one, you could use a scroll saw or a bandsaw, but it's going to be a lot of work. The pieces were all done, but I needed a way to hold them underneath the game board. And to do this, I made another box almost identical to the one that I had already made. I started by measuring the inside of the bottom of this box. Then I followed basically the same process as before. I didn't even have to change anything about the finger joint jig, it was still all set up to make the same size fingers. I used maple instead of walnut for the surround, and for the plywood I used 1/2 inch instead of 3/4 just to cut down on weight and give me a little bit more interior space. My saw tends to burn maple a little bit more, so I had quite a bit more sanding to do on these pieces to get them back to their natural color. But then I just went through the exact same process, glued everything up and clamped it and waited for it to dry. When you make finger joints, it's good to make them a little bit long, that way you can sand them back and get them nice and flush. A disc sander is the best way that I've found to do that. I added some more epoxy to completely cover the surface and used a heat gun to bring the bubbles up to the surface so that they would pop. Be sure not to get the heat gun too close or you'll actually cause more bubbles. While the epoxy cured, I sprayed on a few light coats of spray lacquer onto all the game pieces. I did this in my brand new paint booth, which I made a video about recently. Spray lacquer dries really quickly, so I added a few coats, flipped them all over, and added a few more coats to the other side. The bottom side of the box needed to be finished up the same way as the top, so I sanded off the extra fingers and then used an orbital sander to get rid of any extra glue squeeze out and get all of the surfaces nice and smooth. I keep a little lazy Susan around for doing things like finishing and painting. In this case I was using some tung oil finish, which is a polyurethane and tung oil mixture. The tung oil in this mixture really makes the grain pop no matter what kind of wood you're using, and the polyurethane adds a nice protective coating. Usually when I use this finish I'll do about 2 coats, and that seems to be plenty. I really love the way this stuff makes walnut look. After a couple of coats drying a couple hours each, this game was finished. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.